Welcome to Hidden Figures Behind the Numbers with the Restaurant Scientist. During this podcast, we take an in-depth look into the economics of food service in the restaurant industry. I'd like to start by thanking my sponsors, Cornerstone Business Labs, Cornerstone Production, and Cornerstone Media. Today, I am honored to call these two titans of the industry, not only just my friends, but my mentors. I have Chef Joe Randall and Kevin Mitchell here, and you're just in for it. Just hold on to your seats. This show is going to be incredible. We have an encyclopedia of information and knowledge between these two gentlemen in terms of the history of African American chefs. Let me start by reading Chef Joe Randall's bio. He has owned and managed catering firms as well as provided consulting services to restaurant operations. His broad experience, coupled with the talented of enthusiasm for helping others learn the craft and systems of restaurant excellence, resulted in him serving on the faculty of 4 universities across the country. In the late 1990s, he adopted signature uniform trimmed with hand-woven kente cloth from Ghana as a show of pride of an African-American chef. The magic of Savannah and the city's love for good Southern cooking lured Chef Randall to Georgia, known by many as the Dean of Southern Cuisine. Chef Randall has been cooking up fine Southern dishes in Savannah since 1999 with a motto of, put a little South in your mouth. He founded the Joe Randall Cooking School in September of 2000. He founded the Joe Randall Cooking School, demonstrated basic Southern cooking techniques, and shared his favorite cooking tips with clients from around the world. This bio just goes on and on and on, right? From food, a vehicle of dispel the myths and misconceptions of many visitors and locals alike held regarded in Savannah. He taught two generations, including me and Chef Kevin Mitchell is here today. Food enthusiasts, cooks during his 16 years as Chef Joe Randall's Cooking School. It was located at 5409 Waiters Avenue. The cooking school was transformed into the African American Chefs Hall of Fame in 2017. The African American Chefs Hall of Fame, 2017. A Georgia nonprofit corporation, 501c3, publicly chartered, is a recognized program that celebrates the living history of African American chefs and highlights those individuals who have exhibited extraordinary contributions, helped create the American cuisine, and inspire others. The Hall of Fame hosts occasional cooking classes with Chef Randall and other chefs from across the country. Chef Randall's expertise in Southern cuisine was held in such high esteem that he was honored and featured in the Cultural Expression Gallery in the Smithsonian's Institute of National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. Wow. Welcome, Chef Joe Randall.
Thank you for having me.
Bad man. So, my second guest, this brother has so many acronyms after his name that Kevin Mitchell, CFSE, MASC, Chef Ambassador. So we're going to ask him what all that stuff means a little later. He's a culinary historian. He is a chef instructor at the Culinary Institute of Charleston. He's an adjunct instructor at the famed Culinary Institute of America. He sits on the National Board of Slow Foods, member Southern Foodways Alliance, board member of Bread and Butter of Charleston, South Carolina. South Carolina's Chef Ambassador 2020-2021, member of the Culinary Institute of America's Diversity Board, and member of Cooks Alliance Slow Foods USA. In November 2011, Chef Mitchell earns a certificate executive chef from the American Culinary Federation, as well as a certified food service designation of the Food Service Educational Learning Community. Did I say that right, Chef? In April of 2020, Chef Mitchell became the secretary of the newly formed Edna Lewis Foundation, whose mission is to honor, cultivate, and preserve the rich African-American culinary history by offering a variety of events and programs designated to educate, inspire, entertain, and promote the deeper understanding of Southern culinary culture and heritage. In May of 2013, Chef Mitchell was appointed by the Board of Slow Foods Charleston. In April 2019, Chef Mitchell hosted a dinner at the Drayton Hall called A Night to Remember Drayton Hall, the former plantation, where he paid tribute to African-American cooks and chefs. At the end of 2019, Chef Mitchell was appointed by the governor of South Carolina as the South Carolinian Chef Ambassador. We welcome to the stage Chef Kevin Mitchell.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
No problem. It's funny. There was more to both of these gentlemen's bio, but I just had to kind of trim it down. But it's just so rich, man. You guys have so much respect in our industry. You guys have done so much. And like I said earlier, you truly are, an encyclopedia for those of us that are old school. Before Google, there was encyclopedia, right? I'm honored to have you. So as you gentlemen know, the show objectives is to kind of take a deep dive into the economic disparities and inequalities within the food service industry and how it impacts Black food service professionals and independent restaurateurs. And I want to be clear because I often have to separate those two because the food service industry has many avenues in it. One of them is being a restaurateur and an independent restaurant operator. But for the most part, the food service industry is a lot of the larger corporations, corporate dining. We're talking about an $850 billion industry with 15 million employees. So I like for my listeners to truly understand that we talk about many lanes when we talk about Blacks as it relates to food service and restaurant industry. So, gentlemen, I want to lay the foundation and I want you to basically kind of tell your stories and your experiences, both as African-American chefs, African-American men and professionals, and the way that the industry has evolved. So, I kind of want to go in chronological order and start with, we know in 1619, the Dutch ship, the White Lion, arrived with 20 slaves to Jamestown, Virginia. And 1641, slavery became legal, and chattel workers chattel was workers without rights. We had the antebellum period, from 1812 to 1815, which was pre-Civil War. Then we had the Civil War. Reconstruction period after the Civil War. The 13th Amendment abolishing slavery in 1865, which is 100 years before I was born, 1965. And then you go into Jim Crow, 1865 to basically 1965. So my point in the foundation launching point for this discussion is during those 350 years or so, Blacks were cooking, both male and female. And then it turned into an industry that now we know many African Americans are still in it, but in terms of the disparity and the dollar figures between Black cooks and white restaurateurs and Black restaurateurs, the state of Black food service is definitely in a crisis now. And this show is designed to kind of candidly talk about those issues. So gentlemen, I want to open up the floor to either one of you to kind of start. If we want to start with the elders or you want to start with the young buck chef, we're gonna let you decide on whether you're gonna let Kevin go first or you want to start.
Well, Kevin can stand on his own. I want to just kind of lay a little foundation.
Yes.
In 1963, I went in the Air Force.
Okay.
And Uncle Sam made decisions for a lot of Black folks where they wanted you, and if you weren't in any particular category as far as work experience, Black folks ended up in food service or in the commissary. And I did end up in food service. I worked flight line kitchens, B-52s, and KC-135s. I worked in the kitchen, and we fed those pilots that flew those planes. Now, my first duty station was a unique situation because I was stationed in Turner Field in Albany, Georgia. And so you have to use your imagination to be in Albany, Georgia in 1963. I can remember leaving Harrisburg, and the government person that was directing us to the bus say, you ride the bus. From here to Washington, you can sit anywhere on the bus. But when you leave D.C., sit in the back of the bus is the law of the land.
Wow.
And that was my introduction to going south.
Got it.
You know, and so when I got there and got involved with my division in the department I was in, there were no blacks with any major supervisory positions. You know, the rank was limited. Most of the white boys had all the rank, and the rank was the supervision.
Got it.
But we found some camaraderie, and I was fortunate that I had an uncle that was a chef in Elizabeth and Pennsylvania Large, right outside of Pittsburgh. And Uncle Dick had a catering business and restaurant in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. So I had the pleasure of being around a black chef who ran his own business when I was a child. And I worked with Uncle Dick on some catering parties, and did a little prep around the restaurant when I'd go visit in the summer.
So let's talk about that for a minute, Chef. So at that time, black folks only went to black restaurants. Like, paint that picture for us. Were there black, is it just a special occasion kind of event? Was he open every day? Or were there other restaurants? What was the restaurant scene like? I know most people ate at home then, so it wasn't like.
It was a wonder. It's the perfect question.
Yeah.
Most of his customers were white folks.
Okay.
Those were the ones who could afford to pay.
Got it.
And so he catered a lot of parties, but he did weddings for black folks and things, but that was surely special occasion stuff. But a lot of his banquet catering and stuff in people's homes and churches and stuff was done for white folks.
Got it. And what type of cuisine was he cooking for these white folks?
He was from Virginia, so it was Southern food. That's another good question.
What's the definition of Southern food in 1963?
Okay, let me help you so you understand. Prior to 1983, there was no such thing in America as American regional cooking. It was just good food and bad food, and most of the good food came from the South because the people weren't afraid to season it. So he fried chicken, he made pot roast, he did prime rib. He actually served fried chicken at his restaurant. He served fried chicken and corn fritters in a basket.
Okay.
So it's just natural stuff, but it wasn't about Tex-Mex or California cuisine or anything like that. Because, the 1977, the American Culinary Federation Olympic team won a gold medal with regional American cooking. They had some Texas steaks on the menu, and so that's when it started in the 70s.
Right.
And then Julia Child, James Beard, they all met in New Orleans in 1983 with an interest in defining what American regional cooking was.
Got it. So if we go back to 90, I'm just going to try to parallel some things. So in 1946, James Beard had a cooking show.
Yes.
I Love to Eat. Yes. So now you're talking about in 63, right? So 63 there was a show called The French Chef, and Joyce Chen also had a cooking show. So I'm trying to draw the parallels between if black folks were still cooking in the 40s and 50s and 60s, but yet obviously it was a lot of work and low pay, as you said earlier.
Yes.
You know, when did it shift, and how did we miss out on now this whole, you know, multi-unit, multi-millionaire restaurant tours and celebrity chefs and all this?
Couple things happened.
Okay.
In 1948, Lena Richards had a television show in New Orleans, probably the first black woman with a television show. It was a local show.
Okay.
But she was a caterer. So they were, you know, things did happen, but they didn't necessarily go to the point where we know and have vision of them today. But this is what happened. Around 63 and 64, Lyndon Johnson signed Civil Rights Act. And we started looking at things that we could do other than just work in restaurants. Doors started to open up that never had been opened before. I heard with my own ears civil rights leader of the day make statements like, we don't have to work in your restaurants no more. You know, we can go do other things now. And it was true. Some new avenues were opening up. And everybody didn't want to be a cook.
Got it.
So some of us, you know, walked away from the kitchens.
Got it.
And to fill the void, they reached out and filled it with young white girls, young white boys. You know, culinary schools, the CIA started in 46 in New Haven. There maybe was 500 culinary schools in the country in the early 60s. By the 80s, there were 5,000.
Right.
So they're opening up culinary schools everywhere. And doctors and lawyers were sending their children off to culinary school to become chefs and they wanted to own restaurants. And obviously we weren't part of that as a whole.
Got it.
Because of financing.
Got it. Okay. Any other red line and all the other economic challenges that we were facing? Right. Chef Kevin Mitchell.
Sure.
Let's jump in here. So during this period of time, again, let's talk about some of the legendary culinary hidden figures.
Well, you know, Chef talks about the 30s and the 40s and a little bit beyond.
Yeah.
And many people that know me, my work is dealing with pre-Civil War, antebellum, during slavery, into the end of slavery, into a little bit of into Jim Crow, and that's kind of, I think, where Joe picks up on that as well. But for me, you know, and I will say specific to Charleston,
okay,
many of the cooks, of course, here were enslaved African Americans who, of course, cooked. Either they cooked in the field as enslaved people, but the ones that my work deals with are the ones that cooked in the big house.
Got it.
The ones who were looked at more as professionals, right? So a lot of these people, and I'll name off some, you know, here in Charleston, Eliza Seymour Lee, famous Black caterer who was like the matriarch of enslaved cooks in the city of Charleston. If you were an enslaved cook and you wanted to learn how to cook, Eliza Seymour Lee was the matriarch.
Okay.
Who a lot of these cooks apprenticed under. Now, most famous in Charleston, we have Nat Fuller.
Okay.
And Nat Fuller was formerly a slave cook who was purchased by William C. Gatewood, who was a white gentleman, actually not from the South. He moved, I believe he was from Virginia or maybe New York, but he earned his wealth in the railway system. So he comes to Charleston, he purchases Nat Fuller at the age of 15. He wants Nat to be his manservant. He very much was into entertaining. So he wanted Nat to cook. So he sends Nat to apprentice under Eliza. Eventually, Nat wants to go on and own his own restaurant.
Hmm.
So, like most enslaved people do or did at the time to get out of or get their freedom, they would go into these work for hire deals
Mm-hmm.
with their slave owner. The slave owner would, in Nat's case, bankrolled the money he needed for his restaurant.
Okay.
It's called the Bachelor's Retreat. Very famous restaurant here in the city of Charleston.
Wow.
Anyone that wanted a party catered had to go to Nat Fuller. Period. No ifs, ands, or buts.
Wow.
They basically, his moniker was the culinary genius of Charleston at that time.
Wow.
He goes into the restaurant, owns a restaurant. His major claim to fame, though, is maybe a week and a half, 2 weeks after the Civil War. He hosts a dinner where, for the first time, they say blacks and whites broke bread in the same room under the thought of equality and reconciliation.
Hmm.
But understand where we were. We were in Charleston. Understand what just had happened.
Right.
The Civil War just ended 2 weeks ago. How did he get the food he needed to host this dinner? Well, William C. Gatewood steps in again, helps him bring the food from the railway into Charleston so he hosts this dinner. Now, this dinner, he did 80 people, 40 white, 40 black. Prominent blacks at the time, and also, of course, prominent white. He hosts this dinner. He brings these people together. Myself and a gentleman I work with, David Shields, Dr. David Shields, uncovers the story of Nat Fuller.
Mm-hmm.
He brings it to me through another friend, and he has this bright idea that, hey, let's recreate this dinner 150 years later.
Hmm.
And I want you, Kevin, to stand in the role of Nat Fuller.
Wow.
So in April of 2015, we hosted our own Nat Fuller's Feast. I stood in the shoes. Now here, this is where it gets interesting. Chef talked about these cooks cooking Southern food.
Yeah.
In that time, French food was all the rave here in Charleston, right? Because what happens before the French Revolution brings French to Charleston,
Mm-hmm.
also brings through the revolution in Haiti, also brings in French-speaking Haitians.
Right. Wow.
So French food is on display. So the meal that Nat Fuller cooked was reminiscent of classical French cuisine. So people that were coming to this dinner in 2015, my dinner, were under the assumption that the food was going to be Southern. We're going to do fried chicken and all those other things that people claim to be Southern food. So, of course, and Chef was there.
I was there. It was a wonderful evening.
Wow.
We did
That's
classical French cuisine. So what I want people to understand is that not only do we cook Southern food, soul food, all these synonyms for what people think black food is,
right.
We were highly trained in cooking French food as well.
Right.
And it's during the period of the antebellum period into slavery, almost into Jim Crow. Things changed kind of during Jim Crow as far as restaurants and as far as chefs.
Right.
But the history is there. And then from Nat Fuller, he basically begets all these other black caterers here in the city of Charleston.
Got you.
Looking nationwide, then of course you're looking at Hercules, who cooked for Thomas Jefferson. Not Thomas Jefferson, for George Washington. Sorry. You look at James Hemings, who cooked for Thomas Jefferson. So all these enslaved, formerly enslaved, and even freed cooks were owning restaurants, catering halls, grocery stores, markets, even during the time of slavery.
Yeah. If you do your research, you'll know that some of the most prominent blacks in the country prior to booming car porters were caterers. Philadelphia, 3 or 4 very prominent caterers in Philadelphia. New York, Pittsburgh, Rochester, a lot of major cities had predominantly caterers that were African American.
Got you.
Some of the wealthiest people in those cities of African American descent were caterers.
So when Kevin, tell me, I tell my listeners, I know you told me before, if you Google James Hemings or you Google Hercules or Nat Fuller, the same photo pops up, right? So
Yeah.
to educate my listeners, I told you, first of all, listeners, I told you this is going to be an incredible show. These guys are freaking encyclopedias of knowledge and history. But tell why for those that may Google and those 2 pictures come up for the same brother.
Well, for one, personally, I think, they had to assign a face to these cooks. In the case of Nat Fuller, there was no existing picture of who Nat Fuller was, of what he looked like. So what we did was we commissioned Jonathan Green, a very well-known artist here in the city, to come up with a portrait of what we think or what we thought Nat Fuller would have looked like. Now, this other picture that comes up, as you say, it comes up for James Hemings, it comes up for Hercules. I just believe there are no true pictures of who these people or what these people look like. So it was something that was just created to say, okay, this is probably what a formerly enslaved or even an enslaved cook may have looked like.
Gotcha.
But, to find as Joe said, you have to do your research.
Right. So Chef, just give me a minute. I want to stick with Kevin, and I want to come back, and I want you to talk about the African American museum and the history. Kevin, talk to me or our listeners about the cost, like when these slaves were being traded, right? You wrote a piece, your master's degree From Black Hands to White Mouths. Talk to us a little bit about what you discovered in that and how you came to write that and what you learned from that. And some of the things, in reference to black chefs, as male chefs and female chefs, and what was the value of these quote unquote commodities.
Well, the master's thesis actually comes from the thesis I wrote in the bachelor's program at CIA, which of course that piece was away from me.
My listeners don't know, so go ahead through
that. So that piece was a way for me to kind of chronicle the history of African Americans in cooking, and that's how I think the 3 of us kind of make that connection. I'm writing this paper. I need research. I'm getting some, I needed research.
Yeah.
Jason knew Chef Joe. Jason introduces me to Chef Joe. I just call Joe out of the blue and say, hey, I'm Kevin Mitchell. I'm 19 years old. I'm at CIA. I'm writing this paper and I need some help. I got your name from Jason Wallace. And Joe was so gracious enough to sit and talk with me and give me a plethora of information that I use for my thesis. So in that paper, it just was more, once again, chronicling the history of black chefs in cooking.
Right.
The master thesis is birthed from that. So from black hands to white mouths pretty much just comes from my research and from my work recreating that Nat Fuller dinner.
Okay.
And in that piece, as you talk, there's a chapter called Cooks for Sale. And in that chapter, it talks about the monetary value enslaved people had, whether they were skilled or not. So as an enslaved cook, you were considered a skilled laborer. You would have more value monetarily than someone who maybe worked in the field, right? So if you look at purchasing a cook, how would someone purchase a cook? Well, you can go to 1830 edition of the Charleston City Gazette to the want ads to find a cook. So in these ads, it would say, for sale, black or mulatto, male or female, their ages, and what type of cook they were. So either you were a French cook, a pastry cook, or a complete cook. And not only did you have to have that skill, it was always listed other skills. So if you could sew really well, if you were a good cleaner, it would be listed in this one ad. Now, what's really interesting is that in the ads, it tells you where you can purchase this enslaved cook. What I want people to understand is that for the most part, we hear the narrative that slaves were always sold in public auction, which in that case is very true. But in the case of enslaved cooks, skilled laborers, they were usually sold through private sale, hence the newspaper ads, right? So for lack of a better way to explain, as a enslaved person at 14 years old, and if you were 14 years old and a male, you were worth a lot of money because you could till the fields, you were strong, so on and so forth. However, if the same person was a cook, they would go at a 25 to 50% premium over that original price for that original enslaved person.
Wow.
So cooks were very important. And what people need to understand is when we start talking about, how Southern food comes about and who should be recognized for the food, of course, it has to be the African American. When we talk about cookbooks, the recipes, these recipes came from these enslaved people that were written down by white people and made into a cookbook.
Wow.
So it's just that piece, that chapter was a very hard chapter for me to write. Talk about
it's emotional, absolutely.
The sale of a person,
right?
Though he had or she had this great skill,
right? Yeah.
But you still were purchasing a person.
Wow.
So even as cooks, we were still extremely valuable, and we still are today.
Right. Wow. Yeah. Great information. And as we said earlier, the contributions to African Americans in this industry, in this country, go back 400 years. And it's emotional. It becomes very emotional for me to listen and try to visualize, what that was and how it occurred.
Said for years we were the backbone.
Yeah.
To food service in this country.
Yeah, no doubt.
Because we were the workforce.
Right. So, Chef Randall, talk to me about your Hall of Fame. First, let's just make sure that, I know I read it in the bio, but Chef Randall is actually one of the few chefs that is being displayed at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in in Washington, D.C. So we want to give Chef an applause for that. And let our listeners really know that that's huge.
Thank you. I have to say this. I'm there and I'm honored to be there But the greatest honor is I'm there with three wonderful chefs that were dear personal friends of mine: Patrick Clark, Leah Chase, and Edna Lewis. And I'm the only one still breathing. We lost Leah 2 years ago, Patrick many years ago, and Edna in 2006. But I'm thankful to be in such good company. And I love them all dearly. And I work with them, and I gained so much wealth of love and feeling about the industry from each one of them. Had their own way of showing you. Leah used to have a thing she would say, take what you got and make that work for you.
Right.
You know, you don't try and be somebody else, be yourself.
Right.
And do what you can do to make what you got work for you.
Absolutely. So talk to us about the African American Chefs Hall of Fame that you created, Chef.
Well, the Hall of Fame was something I did not want some of these wonderful cooks to go to be forgotten. And so that was primarily where I started. The chef that I trained under, Robert W. Lee, at the Harrisburg Hotel in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Chef Lee was at the Harrisburg Hotel in 1939. So he was there from 39 to 67. And you know, back in those days, you worked for a restaurant or a hotel owner. So Chef Lee was Mr. Johnson's chef. And so everybody come and go, but Chef Lee was still there.
Right.
And so Chef Lee was a wonderful trainer, wonderful teacher. He was originally from Atlanta, and he migrated from St. Simon's at the Kings and Prince Beach Club through Charleston into Pennsylvania. And he cooked. You know, the hotel was like 2 blocks from the Pennsylvania State Capitol.
Okay.
And they had a Senate caucus dining room. But the food was Southern Foundation. That's why I tell you, this food, we served prime rib. We did, you know, veal sweetbreads. We did all kind of classical things, but we did a foundation of Southern food also.
Okay. So we got 3 to 4 minutes left. Chef Randall, how can people get in touch with you?
They can call me direct, 912-660-5086, or email me at info@chefjoerandall.com.
Okay. And Chef Mitchell, I understand you have a book coming out. Tell us a little bit about your book and how people can get in touch with you.
Yeah, so the book is called Taste the State. And what it is basically, we're calling it a guide to Southern food and ingredients. So if you look at the book, almost like a dictionary, there's about 89 entries, all listed in alphabetical order. So we write about things like okra, we write about purloo, we write about, you know, different dishes or ingredients that have some tie to not only South Carolina, but through Charleston specifically, right? So in each entry, we talk a little bit about some of the agricultural aspects of the ingredient, some of the history, you know, how it was grown, who grew it, when did it first appear in recipe books, so on and so forth. And then we also include recipes. So we will include recipes that are from the late 1800s. We also include more contemporary recipes that I wrote to give people a view into how the how recipes kind of evolved from the 1800s to 2019 to 2020. So we're hoping that the book comes out, they say spring of 2021.
Okay.
It is in copy editing and cover design right now. So Publisher is the University of South Carolina Press.
Okay.
And they're who's done a really great job in introducing me to the world of cookbooks, which is, I mean, we're not calling it a cookbook. I mean, it does have recipes in it, but it's more about understanding the history
book.
of ingredients. So we learn the history of Huguenot torte and the Lady Baltimore cake and some anecdotal things too. So little funny, interesting stories on that specific ingredient or dish.
And how can people get in touch with you?
People can email me at chefscholar@gmail.com. You can also reach out to me at 313-520-1085.
Well, gentlemen, I've just made the decision that I actually want to have you guys back in 2 weeks because we didn't even touch the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. You know, it's just, it's just too much. Well, we talked about the 60s a little bit, but we didn't get into the 70s. And Chef Randall, I know like you got to school us all on, what was going on in the 70s and the 80s. And then Kevin and I could take over from the 90s because, we lived that. But if you guys don't mind, I'd like to put you on the calendar in 2 more weeks and then come back and we're going to do a part 2 of this because 1, you guys are just, like I say, an encyclopedia of information and knowledge. And 2, I love you guys. Like, I just, like I enjoy spending time with you and I could listen to Chef Randall talk for 2-3 hours. Like, it's really crazy.
Now, don't forget now, anybody out there that loves cooking, they need to go out and get a copy of my cookbook, A Taste of Heritage,
okay.
New African American Cuisine. It's over 20 years old now, but it's still available. And it was primarily done as a follow-up to Creole Feast on a national level instead of just being around New Orleans. And Rudy Lombard was a big inspiration to me to get that done. And some wonderful chefs that we know and love. Edna's in the book, Leah Chase is in the book, Patrick's in the book, Timothy Dean's in the book, so Daryl Evans is in the book.
Oh, man.
So all some dear friends are in the book.
Got them all. Okay. Well, gentlemen, again, I want to thank you. I want to also thank my sponsors, Cornerstone Business Labs, Cornerstone Production, and Cornerstone Media. And until we meet again, thank you. You've had an episode of Hidden Figures, Behind the Numbers with the Restaurant Scientists.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you.